Well, hello, everyone, and welcome back to another Monticello live stream. My name is Brandon Dillard, and I am the Director of Historic Interpretation and Audience Engagement here at Monticello. And I'm pleased to be taking a part in hosting this conversation today. For those of you who have been following us online, this is a part two of an ongoing conversation where we'll be talking about Native American histories and Indigenous perspectives with our friend and colleague, Heather Bruegl. At Monticello, we mostly focus on the late colonial period, the early years of the United States. Jefferson's role as a founder, it left lasting impacts on the world, including many legacies that profoundly altered the courses of Native American nations and changed the lives of Indigenous people. Monticello itself resides within the traditional homelands of the people of the Monacan Indian Nation. And of course, the histories of Native nations in North America predate the arrival of Europeans by millennia. But the ways in which Native American people are included within common histories often leaves out so much. Today, we want to spend a little time talking about how that's changed over the years and how it continues to change today as more and more institutions are working to elevate the voices of Indigenous scholars and are telling a fuller story of what it means to be American, both past and present. So for our viewers, remember to type in questions or comments, and we will address those as we go. And everyone, please join me in welcoming back Heather Bruegl. Heather is an Oneida Nation of Wisconsin citizen and first-line descendant Stockbridge-Munsee. She is a graduate of Madonna University in Michigan, and she holds a Bachelor of Arts and a Master of Arts in U.S. History. Her research comprises numerous topics related to American histories, legacies of colonization and indigeneity, including the Dakota War of 1862, the history of American boarding schools, and missing and murdered Indigenous women. Heather has presented her work at academic institutions, including the University of Michigan, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Bard College, Vassar College, and Brooklyn Law School. Heather consults for various museums and universities and is a frequent lecturer at conferences on topics ranging from intergenerational racism and trauma to the fight for clean water in the Native community. She's been invited to share her research on Native American history, including policy and activism, museum equity, and land back initiatives for such institutions as the Tate, the Brooklyn Public Library, and of course, Monticello. Heather opened and spoke at the Women's March anniversary in Lansing, Michigan in January 2018, and at the first ever Indigenous Peoples March in Washington, D.C. in January 2019. In 2019, 2020, and 2021, Heather spoke at the Crazy Horse Memorial and Museum in Custer, South Dakota for its Talking Circle series. Heather's a doctoral student at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay, where she studies First Nations education, focusing on creating inclusive historical narratives for teaching. Heather's a public historian, an activist, an independent consultant who works with institutions and organizations for Indigenous sovereignty and collective liberation. Welcome back, Heather, and thank you so much for joining us again at Monticello.
Hi, thank you.
So, Heather, it's been almost 2 years since we last chatted on a Monticello live stream. Would you mind telling our audience what you've been up to in the last couple of years?
Yeah, for sure. 2 years. Wow, that's been a hot second. If I could first just take a moment and acknowledge the land that I'm coming from. I'm coming from the land of the Three Fires Council, the Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi peoples in Dearborn, Michigan. So I just want to make that acknowledgement. And gosh, 2 years, so much has happened in 2 years. I've moved from upstate New York back to Detroit, Michigan, where I'm from. I have started school, I've started a doctorate program, and most recently I've started a new position as the curator of political and civic engagement at the Henry Ford Museum of American Innovation here in Dearborn, an institution that I grew up going to. So very cool to be here now. But I've also taken on, still freelancing and consulting projects as well. So I've been kind of busy.
That's great. That's great. So, Heather, you and I met to talk about this live stream. We actually met on Indigenous Peoples Day virtually to have this conversation. And once again, for our audience, we realized this could go in so many different directions. Jefferson's role in conceiving some of what were undoubtedly the most impactful U.S. policies towards Indigenous nations. You can't understate that. And his personal writings on Native people, they're every bit as complex and fraught as his roles as both nation builder and enslaver. Last time during our live stream, we talked a lot about colonization, Jefferson's role in shaping the early republic, and I'm sure we're going to get back into some of those topics today. But you and I both work in public history. We share stories about the past with public audiences, and we both seen the ways in which Indigenous histories and cultures have been presented, sometimes really well and sometimes not so well. As part of our planning conversation, we thought today we might talk broadly about this topic of public history and memory and how museums and institutions, and sometimes the broader general public, present or are presented with Native American perspectives. So let's start with do you mind talking a little bit about your work as a Native consultant?
Yeah, for sure. So, one of the goals that I have always wanted to do, being somebody who loves museums, loves going to them, I can spend hours at them. I really want people to walk away having seen themselves inside that facility somewhere, right? That their story is being told, that they haven't been ignored or forgotten. And I focus in primarily on that Indigenous narrative. It was in 2019. I was at a museum conference in Philadelphia, and I went to the Museum of the American Revolution because you're in Philadelphia, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, all those areas, where the founding of the country happened. It was in the Museum of the American Revolution that I first really fully encountered being able to see myself represented in a museum somewhere. And they had done an amazing exhibition consulting with the Oneida Nation, telling the story of the Oneida people's role in the American Revolution. And it was life-changing, I think, in some ways. I was like, oh my gosh, our story's being told. Like, this is great. And not only was the story being told, but it was being told with input from said community. I think that's really important. And so my goal and my work, I want to bridge that gap. I want museums and cultural institutions and historic homes to be able to tell those stories. And so I like to work with those institutions, finding out what their goals are, what the narratives they're trying to tell, and then teaching them and helping them find the skills to then go out and work with said Native nation. I'm not qualified to do an exhibition on Cherokee history. I'm not Cherokee, but I can give you the tools that you need in order to help create that relationship. So then that nation, that you're reaching out to that nation and then helping to tell that story. So a lot of my work revolves around whether it is writing story panels, reviewing story panels, working on land acknowledgements, talking about cultural appropriation, how to tell hard stories, difficult stories. And so that's a lot of the work that I do as a freelancer in my consulting area.
That's great. You and I talked this is a while ago, some months ago, about land acknowledgements and their growing prevalence in institutions, which is great to see awareness around Native perspectives and, again, understanding the longevity with which Native nations have existed in this land before colonization.
Mm-hmm.
But something else you said there about the need to work with Native communities, I think, is really important, especially when it comes to crafting some of those conversations or what it means to be representative is mostly about partnerships. So you said that you can talk with people about that, and I know that you've done some work with the American Association for State and Local History on this, and I know we're both big fans of ASLH. And for our viewers, if any of you are museum people, I know that you know ASLH, and if you're not, Google ASLH. You'll love reading about them. But Heather, would you talk to our audience about some of the work you've done there?
Yeah. So I love AASLH. In fact, that conference I was at in Philadelphia was an AASLH conference. It was my first introduction into the museum world. And I have to say, what an organization to have that introduction with, because they're small, I think on the greater scale of things, they're smaller, right? There's more intimate contact, like one-on-one contact. Connected with a lot of great people across the museum world. So my first introduction with them was through the conference. And then from that, it led to now serving on their education and interpreters committee, which I serve on with a colleague of yours, Melanie. And so that's amazing. And then from there, it's kind of spiraled into other things. I did a podcast episode for them with their Reframing History podcast, which I highly recommend that people listen to that whole series. It wasn't a lot of episodes. I think it was like 6, and they're talking with some really, really great public historians and museum people. So I encourage you to listen to that. But then I also designed a course for AASLH, and it's basically like an intro to Indigenous history. So it doesn't go super in depth. It's very surface level, but it is, talking about terminology, talking about contemporary issues within Indian country today, whether that's MMIW, land back, what have you. And so it gives the person taking the course a very brief overview, and I say very brief overview of Indigenous history. It gives you a base to start at. So when you are beginning your own learning journey and you're going and talking with other Indigenous people, you have a base to then branch off it. So it's I think it's a discounted rate to members in AASLH, and then there's another rate for from people who are not members of the organization. But I've had a few friends in the museum world take the course and give me your feedback, and they said it was super helpful. And I was like, oh, that's great. So good feedback on that.
That is wonderful. And I'm sure that, I hope that some of our viewers are institutional colleagues and friends from other places that should check out that resource, because it sounds wonderful. And I think that part of that, helps us with shaping the public narratives broadly. But there are a lot of generally accepted misconceptions about Native history, about Native peoples. And you and I talked a little bit about that planning for this conversation. Let's, if you, again, I noticed you said very briefly when you talked about the ASLH course, because this could be a never ending conversation. We're talking about hundreds of national polities and millions of people, but just some of those common pitfalls that you've observed over time, and that you feel that you can help broadly with the general public, help deconstruct maybe some of the ways that they've been taught to think about these things historically.
Yeah. Surprisingly, and I can't even believe that this is a thing, but surprisingly, a big misconception is that we don't exist anymore. That Indigenous people, that the genocide that the U.S. started worked, but it didn't, because we're still here. And so that's actually a really big misconception. I've had people come up to me after public lectures that I've given. The one that I tell the most is it was in 2020, just before the world shut down. I gave a lecture, and somebody came out afterwards to me very genuinely and said, "Oh my God, I didn't know Native American people still existed. I thought we killed you all off." And I'm like, "No, you didn't." So that's a huge misconception. And then another misconception that goes along with that is that, okay, so Indigenous people are still here, so you must all be the same. And that's not accurate as well. We're not a monolith. I am a citizen of tribal nations from the New England and New York area. They're not going to be the same as tribal nations in the Southwest, who are not going to be the same as tribal nations in the Plains, who are not going to be the same as Pacific Northwest. We're all different. Do we have commonalities? 100%. 100% we have commonalities. But we're going to tell our stories differently. We're going to have different ceremony. We're going to have different language. So there's going to be all of these different things that make each community very unique, vibrant, and beautiful. So that is a big misconception, that we're all the same. Gosh, there's so many other ones, and I'm literally drawing a blank, but I'm sure they'll come to me as we're talking. But I think, one of the biggest, actually, here's a myth that I like to talk about a lot, is the myth of the noble savage, right? We all get painted in this one light, that we are nature-loving, tree talking. It's like Pocahontas, like the trees talk back to us or something like that. And that myth seems to get shattered when we then speak out about climate change, missing and murdered Indigenous people, land back. And people, in my experience, tend to not like that. They want to keep us in this misconception, in this stereotype that they've created. And that's not who Indigenous people are. We do have a relationship with the land and with the nature. These are all living things, right? But part of that relationship is protecting and stewarding it. So yes, we do need to talk about issues, hard issues. And that's been something that I've encountered over the years, that people, non-Native people specifically, tend to not like that so much.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right. And there's this interesting and long-standing conflict in the way that Native perspectives are told and the myths are perpetuated. But the difference between ownership, and particularly around land, ownership is the right to exploit versus ownership as the duty to protect. And that's such a different worldview. And it's one that I think a lot of people have continued to struggle with, is these broadly conceived cultures conflicted during the colonial period. And everything you just said, of course, made me realize that this is something that we could talk about Thomas Jefferson's role in helping to shape, because Jefferson had so much to say, where it seemed like on the one hand, he is almost honoring and exalting his perspective of what Native American people were. But he's already talking about it in this like were kind of way. Even 50 years ago, while he was president, he's literally treating with Native nations whose military power far exceeds that of the fledgling United States. And thinking about it in those terms is something that's always been, I think, challenging in the way that it's shared in public memory. And I know you spent a lot of time studying Jefferson. So do you have any thoughts about Jefferson and his role shaping some of those myths?
Oh gosh, I have so many thoughts about Jefferson in general. But yeah, so just, I think the importance of words and terminology, Native Americans were, Indigenous people were, talking about us in the past tense when you are literally still communicating and speaking to us in that present tense. When it came to when it came to Indian removal, he, in my personal opinion, opened up that door to make it easier for Indigenous people to be removed with the Louisiana Purchase, because it just opened up more land further west that we could continue to push Indigenous people to. I think Jefferson's own fascination with Indigenous peoples borders on curiosity and fetish. It's really interesting, right? So some of the writings that he might have, or some of his collecting, there's a border. He's walking a very fine line, because he is a man of science. He likes to learn, things like that. But in the same breath, it's almost holding us up on a pedestal of the past, right? Even though during his lifetime, during his presidency, Indigenous people were still very much there. He just made it easier for us to be moved around. And then once that moving starts happening, begins to speak of us in a past tense.
Yeah. And I think, you just alluded to something that I think probably many of our viewers are familiar with, but, we'll drop a link in the chat here as well so that you can research this more about the ways in which Jefferson really presaged later policies like Indian removal that Heather just referenced. And he did specifically write that the Native nations of the East, if they did not comply with his view of how they needed to comply, then they should be moved west of the Mississippi, which of course is exactly what happened for many tribes beginning in the 1830s and all the way throughout the 19th century. And of course, part of that complexity is also in the fact that that area west of the Mississippi was already occupied. So by forcing people into it, you're also forcing people to move out of their ancestral homes, and just conflict that would go on and on. And everything you just said, Heather, to really understand it and to understand Jefferson, you have to just, the man wrote so much, and he was so complicated, and his views about things were so complicated, but they're really such a perfect lens through which we can understand the perspectives of Enlightenment-based Euro-Americans during this time period and the ways in which they were able to espouse freedom and equality as a basis for self-government while enslaving people and perpetuating a cultural genocide and sometimes actual genocide through warfare against Native peoples. So that feels like a good bridge into something that we talked about as well, which is here at Monticello, we spent many years trying to elevate narratives of the people who were enslaved on this plantation by Jefferson. And, this is the work of recognizing Black history as American history and the importance of seeing how these things are very much connected. But that also is true for Indigenous perspectives or any other group of people identified by ethnic or racial background or political background. Like there's all kinds of ways to do this, but recognizing that these stories intersect is key to understanding the complexity of where we come from. And you've done some work on the intersections of Indigenous and Black history, specifically with the Underground Railroad. Would you mind talking about that for just a moment?
Yeah, for sure. It's there was a TV show. I can't even remember what network it was on, but I watched it on Hulu, and I think you still can. So for anyone who wants to stream it, it was actually called Underground. It was literally called Underground. And so I'm watching it, and as I'm watching the show, my mind wanders a lot. So something just sparks, and I'm like, I wonder if Indigenous people were part of and helped with the Underground Railroad, and if so, like in what ways? So I started to research, Indigenous people's role in the Underground Railroad, and found that they were very much assisting in the Underground Railroad. And I thought that was so interesting. And they weren't just assisting in one area. Everybody seems to think that the road to freedom led north, when sometimes that road to freedom led further south into Florida, perhaps, right? So early on. So there were stories of how the Seminole people in Florida would harbor, quote, fugitive slaves. I put that in quotes because, you're not a fugitive. In my opinion, you're just trying to escape this horrific institution of slavery. So people were, enslaved folks were coming south, and the Seminoles were taking them in and then taking them into the back areas of Florida, the swamp areas where it's harder to navigate, where, a fugitive slave catcher might get up to the border and go, I'm not going in there. My horses can't go in there, or what have you. So there were stories of that happening in Florida, and then further north and along the coastal regions, even in the areas of Virginia, in the coastal areas, and then further north, you had tribal nations they weren't necessarily, quote, stops on the railroad, but they would kind of help funnel people further. And then in the north here, particularly in Michigan, because depending on which way I leave my apartment building in Detroit, I can end up in Canada. So we were right there. Right closer to Canada. People were, especially in the winter, it was super easy to cross because the Detroit River would freeze and you could just walk across if you wanted. You had tribal nations here, particularly the Ojibwe and the Odawa, who would help people get to border crossings, get to the river crossings. And that happened, even in Texas as well. You had people that happened in Texas before Texas became part of the United States. It's important to note that this was well before Florida and Texas became part of the United States, because after they became part of the United States, Texas in particular entered in as a slave state. So the Indigenous, there's always been a really unique history between Indigenous people, Indigenous folks, and Black folks, right? Just coming together because our history is so entwined. Because there is also the interesting history, though, of Indigenous nations also being slaveholding nations. So it's important that I acknowledge that not so happy piece of history. You have the many tribal nations that are now in Oklahoma, who were in the southeastern part of the United States before removal, have freedmen's associations. So like Cherokee, Choctaw, all of those tribes. Cherokee Nation, in fact, was a very, very large slaveholding nation. They had plantations. They had, and so funnily enough, or interestingly enough, I'm not sure which word to use there, when Cherokee Nation was finally removed out of the southeastern part of the United States on the Trail of Tears, which everybody knows about, their slaves, their enslaved people went with them, right? And then later on, there had to be specific additions into their tribal constitutions recognizing these enslaved folks as members of Cherokee Nation, because just like in white slaveholding communities producing more enslaved children, the same thing happened in indigenous slaveholding communities. So as much good that came out of indigenous nations helping along the Underground Railroad, I do think it's important to acknowledge that other side of the history in indigenous nations being slaveholding nations. I think it's important to acknowledge that as well. So the good and the bad, which is something we don't seem to do in mainstream history, but I think it's important to do here.
Thank you. I mean, thank you for that. And that's right. And I think you and I have talked about this. You know that affects my family history a great deal. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's worth talking about with the ways in which many of these indigenous nations are still grappling with this very fraught aspect of their own history. And Cherokee Nation has done a lot of that work, though it has been a legal battle in recent years. But I know that as recently as a few months ago, I was at the Cherokee National History Museum in Tahlequah in Oklahoma, where there's an exhibit focused on the freedmen called We Are Cherokee. And it talked about this long history. So that history is becoming part of these raised conversations as well. And I think that you're absolutely right, that it's about grappling with all of the complexity. And it makes me think about the ways in which so many Native nations divided in various different conflicts in the history of the United States. And obviously this one is, during the Civil War, there were Native nations that allied with the United States. There were Native nations that allied with the Confederacy, and they often broke down on regional, locations where those nations were, but also whether or not they were enslavers. And that's complicated, but that's also true for the American Revolution, that some nations, like you mentioned, the Oneida, in the American Revolution, fighting as patriots, and the Cherokee divided over some of those fights. So I think that for our visitors and for our audiences, understanding the ways in which these conflicts also impacted Indian country is really important.
Yeah, I think it is important to make sure that we talk about those difficult histories within our own historically ignored narratives. Like, we still have so much to talk about. But yeah, whether it was the Civil War, where you had nations on either side of the line, Mason-Dixon line, fighting each other, and even after, even in the Reconstruction era, right? There was a struggle for nations, indigenous nations, particularly Cherokee Nation. There was a bit of a struggle. They were it was the southern states who had joined the Confederacy were welcomed back in, no problem. You just have to ratify the 13th Amendment. Whereas you had indigenous nations who were almost sanctioned for their role in fighting in the Confederacy, which was really interesting because you had a group of people who were in essence committing treason, right? And then you had another group of people who were never considered citizens, who were punished harsher. And I was like, that's really interesting. But even in the American Revolution, well, the precursor to that, the French and Indian War, the American Revolution, and the War of 1812, all three of those lumped together, you had Native nations still fighting on either side during the French and Indian War. It was, hey, the British are bringing entire families over. Maybe it's better to align with the French, who are kind of integrating themselves into our communities. Okay, well, that war is over now. Now we've got the American Revolution happening. Well, the Americans say they're going to help us. They say they're going to, do this and do that. So let's align with them. And then that ends. And you've got Native nations who are then pushed out of land, who fight on the side of the Patriots, come home and find their land has been taken. Well, then you've got 1812, and they're like, you know what? Y'all did us dirty one too many times. We're going to, fight on the other side, and still being penalized. But yeah, it's really interesting to think about how, but in some instances too, it's interesting to think about um, how the tides of war would have changed if it wasn't for Indigenous nations. During the American Revolution, I think about Valley Forge, right? Washington and his troops at Valley Forge in the middle of the winter, starving, absolutely starving. Who breaks that famine? My ancestors, the Oneida people. So it's like, here is one of our staple foods, corn. Here's all the different ways you can use it, right? And the famine is over, and they're eating. The soldiers are eating. So it's like, if that hadn't happened, what would have happened instead? So I think, Indigenous nations are not given enough credit for their role in shaping this country. And helping to protect and preserve it.
Yeah, I can't help but think about if the Wampanoag hadn't fed the Pilgrims, they would have starved. If the Powhatan had not fed the settlers at Jamestown, they would have starved. If the Mandan had not housed Lewis and Clark, they would have frozen to death, and probably the whole thing would have failed. So there's so many times throughout history where these really seminal roles were played by Native people, and that's often left out of the broader discussion. So thank you.
Absolutely. The common theme there being they all would have starved.
Right. And there's this wonderful joke that's often told at some of these sites in Virginia about how the English come here with their cool weather English crops, and they're too busy digging for gold to actually pay attention to that food anyway, and they never found any gold. But they they plant these cool weather crops in Virginia summer, and they just don't survive. So.
Right.
Indigenous knowledge systems are what saved colonists in the first place.
Absolutely.
So that's so much. I mean, we just talked about so many different things, so many different historical things over time. So let's talk a little bit about the legacies, if we can, because things that happened in the past very much shape our world today. And similarly to how you were talking earlier about how the mythology of Native peoples is fine so long as it doesn't go outside of that comfort zone. This is also true for conversations about the past, that often it's okay to have hard conversations about the past so long as we don't go out of the comfort zone of recognizing the ways in which they impact our world today. But the reality of this is that many of these histories specifically have great repercussions that are felt by Indigenous people, the descendants of Indigenous people and Native nations across North America and all of the Americas. So what are ways in which the people listening here, watching this live stream, what are ways in which they might encounter some of these legacies?
Yeah. Oh gosh, I don't even know where to start. We live in a super interesting time. And I'm going to choose my words super carefully. We live in a very interesting time where there is a shift happening in how people want to learn and what they want to learn. And you've got groups that are actively trying to stop some narratives being told because it paints the United States in a light that's not positive. The sad thing is, though, if we don't learn those hard truths and we don't learn those hard narratives, we don't learn the history that makes us feel icky for about 30 seconds, and then we feel okay again, we're bound to repeat it. And I know that sounds super cliche, but it's super true. It's super true. If we don't learn it, we're going to repeat it. I think back to the summer of 2020 and the protests that happened in Charlottesville and across the country, even before that. Those looked oddly familiar to me when I was watching them unfold live. And the reason they looked oddly familiar to me is because they've happened before over the same things. So it's really important that we talk about those hard narratives and those hard truths, because as a nation, it only makes us collectively stronger if we talk about them, if we learn about them, if we acknowledge them. It's really important to. I am the granddaughter and great granddaughter of boarding school survivors. My grandparents went to a Lutheran mission boarding school in Wisconsin, and my great grandparents went to Carlisle in Pennsylvania, probably one of the worst boarding schools in the United States. That fact makes people uncomfortable because they have to reckon with a past. They have to reckon with something that a federal government that they love did. And we have to talk about those because we have to have healing. And once we have healing, only then can we grow. And, we're coming into some pretty important anniversaries that are coming up. And I'm very worried that we're only going to get one side being told ever if we don't address these hard truths. And so I think that's super important. I know Monticello itself has done some really great work on addressing those hard truths, not only in the past of the United States, but in its own past, right? Acknowledging the land, acknowledging the enslaved families that were there, talking about the complicated thought processes of who is considered one of the greatest historical figures, right? So I know you guys have done some really hard truths there, and I know it's been received really well, and some people have also been like, what are you doing? But it's important work that has to be done, and it's not always easy. It's not always fun. It's emotionally taxing, but we have to confront those truths, because if we don't confront those truths, we're just going to keep repeating it.
Yeah, I think maybe this is a good time to throw in a Thomas Jefferson quote, which is, history, by apprising them of the past, will enable them to judge of the future. So it's, you said it's cliche. I mean, it's something that a lot of people have said over the years, that we do need to look at the past so that we can make better judgments for the future.
Yeah,
And
for sure.
you mentioned boarding schools, and I've personally, I feel that in public discourse, so in academic circles, the boarding schools have been talked about for a long time, written about for a long time. But it seems like as more media outlets are giving voice to Indigenous people and Indigenous creators and Indigenous artists, there are conversations around boarding schools. And, I don't know if you watched Reservation Dogs. A lot of people I know watched Reservation Dogs. And the way in which boarding schools is built into the narrative of that, instead of being forced into by people who didn't experience it, but as just part of the life experiences of people, it invites viewers to consider in a very different way. And so I think one of the hardest things that I know that you work on, that we've talked about, and that's really worth us spending a couple of minutes talking about here, to just raise awareness around it. And, missing and murdered Indigenous people, it's a horrible reality throughout Indian country. And we have had some abstract conversations about the ways in which historical figures, or the mythological presentation of historical figures like Pocahontas, like Sacagawea, the ways in which they can be seen as representations of this longstanding reality of the exploitation of Native women by European settlers. So I think some of our audience probably knows about this, but some people might not be as familiar with MMIW. Would you mind talking about it for just a minute?
Yeah, absolutely. So MMIW or MMIP, it's said a number of different ways. MMIP is more inclusive because it's not just Indigenous women that go missing. Majority, yes, it's Indigenous women, but we also have our Indigenous men, two-spirited, transgender relatives that go missing as well. So if we, I've also seen MMIR, missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. Yeah, so this is an epidemic. I call it an epidemic because it really is. That happens within Indian country, where our Indigenous family members go missing and are or murdered. It is it's difficult because justice is hard to find, but it is important that we talk about it and bring it more into the mainstream. about 70 to 80% of perpetrators are non-Native folks. That's a lot. That's a lot. The third leading cause of death amongst Indigenous women is murder, and that's according to the CDC. Trafficking of Indigenous, primarily Indigenous women, but Indigenous folks, goes up in areas where there are pipelines, where there are easy access to roads and or international border crossings. So Detroit would be one. Anywhere there's there's a area in Minnesota where it's easy accessible into Canada. Montana and Bighorn County is a huge area where this happens, and the statistics for finding and or reporting on a missing Indigenous relative are low. The success rate is low. The resources that tribal nations receive to combat this issue is low. And then there's jurisdictional challenges that come into play because reservations are governed and overseen by various different agencies at the federal level. So it's really interesting. I encourage people, if they want to know more, to look at the National Coalition to Stop Violence Against Indigenous Women. That is a great organization to find more information about it. But it's a tough issue to talk about. It's tough being an Indigenous person, but knowing that is a reality. But we've got great activists, boots on the ground people who are working and forming groups, passing legislation that help protect Indigenous peoples. And yeah, it's a tough issue.
It is, but awareness is so much. So Thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for helping to raise that awareness for our audiences. And I think that, these conversations, they're conversations that they're hard to have. They are psychologically taxing. And that's about the contemporary challenges or the historical realities. But you earlier talked about the ways in which there's good and bad to all of this. And it's an emotional roller coaster, but that's being human.
Yeah.
Right? That's life. And really looking at it helps us have a fuller understanding. So all these things together, and you mentioned we have some anniversaries coming up, and we've been talking about this. The whole museum field has been talking about the ways in which the United States of America is planning to commemorate the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, of the creation of the United States as a country. So that's a complicated proposition for a lot of Native communities, right? For everything we just discussed, for the ways in which Native communities helped play a major role in that, for the ways in which individuals fought against it or sided with it. I mean, it's never ending in the complexity. So sovereignty is a big part of this too, which you also mentioned, and we just can't cover all of it because there's just too much to talk about. But what does this anniversary mean to you? And what can it mean?
Oh gosh. Okay. As a historian, 250 years, that's young, right? That's still really young in comparative to European nations and other nations. So wow, huge, 250. And we're just barely hanging on, but we've got it still, right? We got this. As an Indigenous person, as an Indigenous historian, if I take off public historian hat and I put on Indigenous historian hat, I'm not sure what it means. It's a complicated anniversary, right? The Declaration of Independence, which I have talked about with you extensively, and I have been quoted as saying it's one of the greatest breakup letters of all time, right? Just it's not you, it's me, kind of situations. Refers to my ancestors as merciless Indian savages, right? That's how we were thought about. So it's what does that document really mean to Indigenous people, to Black people? What does it mean, right? Because it says freedom for all of us, right? But it didn't really mean all of us. And I'm thinking about the 250th and what's going to happen. And I feel like we're going to have those same old, yay, America, we did it, freedom for all, without talking about the underlying issues, without talking about the narratives that we don't hear. And so I'm hoping, as a historian, as an Indigenous person, that when we are talking about this 250th and we have these celebrations or whatever, we include and put up front those narratives that we don't hear about that often or ever in some cases. And so that's what I'm hoping happens at museums and cultural institutions across the country, that we all, in some way, shape, or form, talk about the narratives that we don't always hear, because those personally are the stories that are the most interesting. Everybody knows the story of the Declaration of Independence, right? Everybody knows Thomas Jefferson wrote it. No offense, but I want to hear from other people, because there are a lot of people in this country, myself included, when it comes to the 4th of July, go, what does it really mean for me? And I'm going to just be flat out honest with you. I don't really celebrate the 4th of July. I don't really do anything on it. Because what did it mean for my ancestors? What did it mean for my grandpa, who was 13 years old before the United States said, yeah, you're a citizen, right? What did it mean for my, other relatives who in 1978, the government finally said, yeah, you can practice your ceremony again legally? What does it mean? What does it mean? So I'm hoping, maybe, as a big hope, we can change the narrative and talk about harder truths on the 250th, and talk about the stories and the people who we don't hear about, whether it's Indigenous folks, Black folks, women, Asian folks, all the people who helped build this country, because we only seem to talk about one set, and we needed to be talking about everybody.
Thank you, Heather. Couldn't agree more. I know that a lot of the work that we've been doing here at Monticello, and I'm going to loop this one question that we got in here about bringing Native histories onto the mountaintop here at Monticello. It's part of our goal, right? Is to tell the fullest history that we possibly can, the truest history that we can. And that means as many different perspectives and as many different peoples as possible. Are we still going to talk about Thomas Jefferson at Monticello? Of course, we're still going to talk about Thomas Jefferson at Monticello. We're going to talk about the Declaration of Independence. But isn't it so much richer to be able to share so many other histories of people who played just as important of a role in the shaping of this country, who continue to shape this country today, and how we as a nation are so much stronger when we are all together and looking at some of these hard truths and trying to solve them collectively. So once again, you and I barely scratched the surface, went through almost 50 minutes super fast, because there's so much that we could keep talking about. I just want to thank you again. I look forward to more conversations. I think that we should keep doing this. And thank you so much for joining us at Monticello. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with our audiences.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Yes, apparently we need to continue this as a series, because there's so much we can talk about. And just thank you to you and Monticello, and for the great work that I know you're doing there as well, Brandon. So I really appreciate you.
And thank you so much, Heather. It's been a great pleasure. I hope to talk again soon.
Yes, for sure.
And thanks to our audience for tuning in. We'll hope to see you again at our next live stream. As always, thanks for joining in with Monticello, and we look forward to sharing more histories with you anytime that you go to our website. Thanks so much.
Thanks.